Welcome to the Rhode Island State Archives and Public Records Administration webinar, Digital Records, Characteristics, Management, and Responsibilities. The Rhode Island State Archives and Public Records Administration is a part of the Rhode Island Department of State Office of the Secretary of State and is under the Division of Archives, Library, and Public Information. We are responsible for the state archives, which preserves and makes available public records from 1638 through the present, as well as the Public Records Administration, which provides records management assistance and storage services to state agencies, and we also provide advice on records management to local government. So let's briefly talk about the life cycle of a record, because if you work for state government, local government, or a quasi-state agency, you are now a records manager, and you are responsible for managing the life cycle of a record that you create. From the time of creation through its use, distribution, dissemination, and retrieval, its maintenance, which could mean its storage on a network or cloud-based system, its inspection throughout its life, to make sure that it is still in a readable format, or migration to a human readable format for the life of this record. Then the disposition. The disposition means the time of retention. So when a record has met retention, it can be properly disposed of by the creation of a certificate of records destruction, its submission to the State Archives and Public Records Administration, and once you have a signed copy of that approved certificate of records destruction, you may properly dispose of those records. If they are long-term or permanent, you may never destroy those records, and you must work with the state archives to make sure that there is a digital preservation plan in place to ensure the longevity and human readability of all of your records. That may involve the transfer to the state archives for the permanent storage of those records. So let's talk briefly about what it means when you create a public record. The content of the record is the substance of the document, which includes any text, data, symbols, or other images and sound which are part of the document. The structure is the manner in which the elements are organized, interrelated, and displayed. The context is the organizational, functional, and operational circumstances surrounding its creation, receipt, storage, or use, and its relation to other materials. All of those together comprise the public record itself. So all three of those, the content, the structure, and the context, need to be maintained for the life of that record. So as we've already discussed, you are responsible for managing your records. Agencies bear the responsibility for the establishment of records management programs and the management of their records. This means that as a government employee, you are responsible for creating records that are complete enough to document all your legally mandated activities, as well as maintaining the records of all policies, decisions, and transactions through the course of your work. So the life cycle of the record from creation, maintenance, and use through disposition is your responsibility. So we've already discussed some of the challenges of digital records, including the overwhelming volume that are created and the need for authenticity and version control and effective retrieval and maintenance throughout its life cycle. Some of that can be achieved through good file naming conventions. Here is some guidance for your file naming. Keep your file name short but meaningful. Use only alphanumeric characters. Do not use special characters. Do not use spaces in the file name. Put the most important information first and include the dates, but format them consistently with each record. Include a version number if there will be multiple versions Use leading zeros when using sequential numbering, and that means use as many leading zeros as you anticipate there being that number of documents. Don't overwrite the file extensions such as .doc or PDF or XCL. And most important, be consistent. If you are going to be creating 100 documents in a certain record series over the course of your career, it will be much easier if they all follow a similar file naming convention, and then it will be easier to manage, retrieve, and dispose. So let's talk about some of the additional responsibilities you bear as a records manager. You need to be able to ensure the authenticity of a record, which means it is demonstratively genuine and not a counterfeit and free from tampering. You also need to ensure the integrity of a record, which means addressing concerns about any potential loss of the physical or intellectual elements that make up that record. Digital records by themselves lack the information to remain intact, readable, and understandable over time due to obsolescence. So the metadata is necessary to ensure the future readability and comprehension of a record. And metadata, or information about information, is the information needed to properly manage the content, context, and structure of digital records throughout their entire life cycle. As a records manager, it is your responsibility to preserve that content, structure, and context for every record through its whole life cycle, or until its retention period has been met. So let's briefly talk about email, because we all receive and send such a huge volume of email that we'll talk about this in much more detail in a future webinar. But right now, let's just briefly discuss what emails you are responsible for saving. Can you delete it? Well, the sender of each individual email should be responsible for maintaining that email. If you sent the message, you are responsible for saving the message. If you were copied on the message, it's still the responsibility of the primary recipients to store the record. If you received an email from outside your agency, you should save that message. And you can delete internal messages that you did not send, unless it was updated or edited by you, in which case it should then be your responsibility to save. So how do you preserve digital records? Well, digital records should be stored in a location designated by your agency for maintaining and protecting public records. A proper storage location for digital records would not be on your private storage or desktop, on a portable disk such as a CD, a flash drive, a thumb drive, etc., or on an email system/server. You should also not keep all of your digital records. You would face increased costs, as well as issues with discovery and legal fees, the administration and staff needed for the maintenance of all records, migration and recopying of all records, as well as the disaster recovery and restoration of all records, and energy costs would be prohibitive. You do not want to save the needle in the haystack. Less hay means that it is easier to find the needle. So all digital records should be treated the same as your paper records were treated, which is you should use the records control schedules that serve as a guide and legal permission for the disposal of records that have met retention. Let's briefly talk about the steps required for the digitization of paper records. If you have paper records that you are interested in putting into a digital format for more ease of retrieval and dissemination, you will need to complete a Notice of Intention to Digitize form, which can be found on the State Archives and Public Records Administration website, or can be requested by contacting us. This form will outline your plan for the digitization project and the steps you're taking to make sure it is a success. In addition, For records with a retention of more than 20 years, it is required that you complete a digital preservation plan. It is recommended for records of all retention, but it is required for those with a retention of 20 or more years. And this digital preservation plan will outline the steps you take to maintain the integrity and authenticity of these records throughout their life cycle. There is also a records management regulation available on the Code of Rhode Island Regulations for your use. So let's talk a little bit more in depth about the challenges posed by digital records and their preservation. We've talked quite a bit about obsolescence in this webinar, and that comes into play with the technology and knowledge needed to maintain records throughout their entire life cycle. The tools to do this are constantly changing and upgrading. Digital records are at a much higher vulnerability for loss and destruction due to the upgrades and deterioration of the environments in which they are created, maintained, and retrieved. The management of digital records is much more complex than paper records stored in filing cabinets, and much more important and costly to maintain. There is a commitment to long-term planning, a continuing responsibility, and investment for digital records that was not necessary for the paper records they replaced. So it's important to remember the information contained must be on a tangible medium, it must be stored, retrievable, and perceivable. You have to keep in mind the vendor mortality rates and the disappearance of product support on proprietary software and hardware environments. You must have an organizational policy that includes long-term planning, thinking, and training about these records. And you must keep in mind the budget constraints and what money you have to spend and where it should be best allocated to maintain the records that are required of state government. So let's talk about obsolescence one last time. The obsolescence of paper records on acid-free paper is hundreds of years. It is not an issue for preservation, maintenance, or retrieval, and it's something that we have all been doing for decades. Acidic paper was still readable and easier to maintain for up to 100 years. Microfilm is stable and readable for up to 500 years. However, the hardware and software and operating systems that maintain your digital records are variable. No one knows the length of time that a CD, network, piece of software, or hardware will be viable. It is changing all the time. So there is a huge potential for loss. We can lose the data, which is the content of the record itself, including the language markings, any visuals and color coding. We could lose the appearance, the structure, the layout of your record. We could lose a relationship that record shares with other records. In other words, its context. There is the potential for loss of any or all of these factors. What are the current solutions to mitigate obsolescence? Well, LOCKSS, which is lots of copies, keep stuff safe principle, is always preferable. It means keeping multiple copies in multiple locations, as well as keeping multiple copies in multiple media formats. So you may have a digital master copy as well as a paper or microfilm copy of any important record. You need to refresh the format of old records. So that means copying old CDs onto a new CD after a certain number of years, or copying records off a thumb drive onto a shared network folder. Conversion. Conversion will allow you to copy records off of old floppy disks onto a thumb drive or shared network. Migration allows you to move records from an outdated software format to a more stable preservation format, such as PDF-A. And emulation. Emulation is used when records are in a system that is no longer sustainable. So you are using a new system to emulate the look, feel, and behavior of the previous system. So let's review. As a government employee, you are a records manager, and you are responsible for maintaining records throughout their life cycle. A record is comprised of its content, its context, and its structure. Those three elements must be maintained throughout the life cycle of the record for it to be considered a complete record. And all public records must be maintained as complete records, whether they are made or received. This includes maintaining the metadata, which is vital to the understanding and preservation of digital records, and it relates to more than just the description of the object. The trustworthiness of your records helps to ensure the authenticity and integrity of the record, and retention schedules serve as your guide and legal permission to begin the disposition and destruction of records that have met retention. Remember that digital records do not have a single retention period. Retention is based on the content of the record and record series it belongs to and does not include the format of the record. How long you need to keep a record is determined by where it falls on a records control schedule, and that can be either a general record schedule, a state agency specific schedule, or a local government schedule. When a record has met its retention, you will need to complete a certificate of records destruction and submit it to the State Archives and Public Records Administration. When you have received an approved and signed copy of that CRD, you may then appropriately dispose of the records listed on that certificate and replace the records disposed with the signed certificate itself. That concludes our training on digital records. If you have any questions, please contact the State Archives and Public Records Administration at records@sos.ri.gov or by phone 401-222-2353.